Hello, everybody. My name is Martin Vierne, and today we're going to take a look at designing multiplayer maps for our first-person shooter 9 to 5. The title of the talk is called "It's Going to Be Fine." It's because nobody knows what we're doing, but it's going to be fine eventually. All right, so welcome everybody, and let's get to it. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction. So as I said, I'm Martin. I'm the lead environment artist here at Redhill Games. We're working on a free-to-play multiplayer tactical first-person shooter. And our environment art team is responsible for supporting and creating the layouts of the maps in collaboration with the level design team, which is currently 2 people. Right now, we are 3 environment artists, and we're recruiting 2 more to join the team as soon as possible. Of course, right now it's a bit complicated, and everybody's working remotely. Our pipeline consists mostly of 3S Max, Substance Designer, Painter, and ZBrush. This is like the rough lines of what we're doing. So just very quickly about me, so we can put a little bit of context. I have a traditional art background, and my spouse is an architect, so I have both those interests. I worked in games for about 11 years now. I started as a level designer, and slowly I moved towards the environment art. I have done many layouts throughout my career. As a matter of fact, this is what I was mostly doing for quite a bit of years. The recent productions include Quantum Break and Control. And right now I'm working on 9 to 5. I have professionally worked mostly on third-person narrative games, but originally when I started before working in games, I was modding. And I was modding for Crysis at the time, and Quake 3, Written Castle Wolfenstein, Half-Life, all those games. So I kind of started by doing multiplayer first-person shooter maps. And last but not least, I grew up playing a lot of skirmish tabletop war games and building terrain for it. As a matter of fact, I realized that I spent more time painting miniatures and making terrain than actually playing. And this is sort of very related to environment art in general. All right, so let's travel back in time. When Redhill was founded in 2018, we were working on a prototype where we had teams of mercenaries, which would perform various jobs for mega corporations. It was supposed to be set in the close future, like maybe, let's say, 30, 40 years from now. The initial prototypes that we had environments like very huge towers, like mega blocks, where you would work your way up floor to floor towards your objective as a team. And it started as a PvE shooter. We realized that the environments would rapidly become repetitive, and there was a potential problem in art fatigue, and it was kind of boring. We dabbled a little bit with random generation of those levels. And then we were like, okay, let's try something else. And we tried an approach where we would be using, instead of like a huge tower, we would use more like a city block. So we approached it a bit like you would set up a table for a skirmish tabletop war game. So we would build like a city block in sort of an open world fashion. And the block would have sort of a high density, and the objectives would be placed with a random component so that we would have a really good replayability. So maybe you have to do something here, but the next time you play would be another place and then another place, etc., etc. So it would be one map, but you would be able to play in a lot of different settings. And that's it. The first prototype was there. So you can see it here on the image. So that's the first sort of city block that we built. The objective building was like the little hab block that you can see in the middle. This map was about 80 by 80 meters. And as you can see, like the density and the size is roughly what you would expect from a modern first-person shooter. It's about the same size in terms of environment. So now we had this this prototype, and we knew a little bit more because the game started to shape up. Now, the idea was that we would be having 3 teams of mercenaries fighting each other's, not AIs anymore. So we turned from PvE to PvP. And those teams would fight each other's for the same objective, sort of like a competition. The map would need to be quite big, but the core idea was still there. So the map would obviously need to be a little bigger because we had 9 players and we needed some space for those to be interesting. So what we did is we started to make a generic 2D layout, like just a top-down view. And we used it, put it on a flat plane, put it in the engine, and started walking on it to see about the size, like if it was interesting. We decided sort of randomly that our area would be 100 by 100 meters, and then we decided it was too small. So we kind of arbitrarily decided like, hey, let's try 200 by 200 meters. And we started to build an urban layout to see where it would take us. At this time, we had like basic functionalities and we could play, etc. But it was still kind of like diving into the unknown. Also at the time we settled down on a New York setting, and I started looking at Brooklyn because we couldn't really have it downtown, because downtown, like Manhattan, is like very, very high rise, high buildings. The streets are quite wide. It's not ideal for a layout. So I started looking at Brooklyn that has more of a human scale. So how does it look like a 200 by 200 in real life? Like what are we talking about here? So I went to Google Maps and I started looking at like different areas in Brooklyn and starting to measure squares of 200 by 200, like what could fit in there, basically. And I found a couple of areas that were pretty interesting that would fit our needs quite well. On this picture, you can see the area that I sort of selected. I spent many hours on Google Maps and I settled on with that one, which is about 200 by 200 meters, and it's based on like a real world location. So the sizes are realistic. As you can see, it is quite much larger than our first prototype. And it has a good selection of different types of area. By different types of area, I mean, we have this like big building, like habitation blocks, a little parking lot, some shops. It has quite a nice selection of very different areas. Okay, so after we started doing this, we're still trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to build that? So I used the satellite data as a very rough reference on a plane, and we started to build the map from there. So very quickly, I blocked out the main shapes of the main building, so basically just boxes. So we could start walking around and get like a feel of the space. Since it was based on satellite data, it kind of felt good already, but we needed to know a little bit more. Our first game mode, Intel, I think now it has a different name. The game mode was being developed at this point, so we started to work on the objective area, which is obviously the main focus of the game mode. So I started detailing the buildings around that specific area, detailing a little bit more, but not like crazy, just so that we can start playing. And those were our first playtests. And then we started playing again and again and again and refining the layout as we went. We knew that we would use other locations later because it's quite a big map, but we needed to lock down the core gameplay and test the map. So the map would allow plenty of space use like later on. So we focused only on one flow. And then we played more and more and more. And then we would debrief and discuss like, okay, what went well, what didn't work, et cetera, et cetera. And then we tweaked the map based on the play tests to add or remove terrain features so that it would make the experience more interesting. And little by little, our blockouts got more and more details, like slowly, little by little, new locations, new access routes, new hiding spots, window openings, escape routes, rooftops, etc., etc. Here you can see a little bit more advanced. So that's the block out here, based on the previous picture. So this is a very rough block out, as you can see, like we're talking just elevation here. And we started to implement the different locations. And it was very, very much focused on the playtesting. And basically, we developed the layout based on our playtests. So here is what you can see is like the very, very sort of early days of the map. It's very, very simple. So, but the problem is now, okay, how do we do that? Because now we have a block out, it works, okay, it's cool. But the general layout needs to be very, very open. It needs to allow free roaming, and it needs to support and offer many, many different topographies. Every specific areas that we have, I think we end up with like about 20 at the moment, like 20 different locations. And every single area needs to be interesting on its own, because let's say you play a game mode and the objective is in this room or this alley or this building. Well, every single area needs to be interesting. Every single area needs to be reachable from any other area in its vicinity. Like you need to be able to go somewhere, go back, etc., quite quickly and intuitively. Each area needs to support, because we don't know what all the game modes are going to be at this point. Like, right, we have only one game mode that works. People in the level design department are working in other game modes, but we still don't know about those. So we're making the map without really knowing about them. So we kind of went for those like 5 sort of different categories, like big categories of objectives. So assault, defense, capture, interact, evade. So those are different types of objective that could potentially regroup different game modes, because those are like different sort of ways that you can have objectives played. And then, of course, making layouts, the golden rule is that you just have to accept that your layouts are going to be trashed anytime, and you're going to be redoing them again and again and again. So what do we know now that we have done those playtests and that we have those plans of different game modes and random placement of the objectives, etc., etc.? Well, what we have learned is that 3 teams means that the map needs to be very large. The map needs to support all the possible game modes that will come eventually. The map needs to support the 3 rounds system. We have every match that we have in 9 to 5 is based out on 3 rounds. So the outcome of one round affects what you're going to be doing in the round after that. It's very dynamic. So, but it also means that the layout needs to support that. We need also to support variations in terms of objective placement. As I mentioned previously, let's say you have to capture something or get something from somewhere. Well, it could be in area 1, area 16, area 5. So all those areas need to work for any potential game mode that we have. We need to support, of course, all sorts of players and play styles. We need to have different ranges, different heights. It needs to be interesting for people that like close combat. It needs to be interesting for people that like sniping, people that like mid-range, close range, etc. People that like to play sneaky, people that like to rush. It needs to support all this. The map needs also to be open enough so that it supports emergent gameplay. Like we cannot plan, and we just have to accept that we cannot plan everything that's going to happen. So something will happen during playtest, and we go like, okay, we broke the flow, but this is actually cool because now this is happening. So do we let it happen, or do we try to prevent it, knowing that all sorts of unexpected things are going to happen? So the map needs to support that. And of course, we need enough variations in the layout to let people and players basically wander, discover, and master the map. Like we want to make the map very dense, but we don't want to make the map like an old school way where you can just press forward and it will just lead you somewhere. We want people to have a little bit of trouble at first, so then they get the satisfaction of knowing the map. And now is another picture of the previous layout, but I think it's like maybe 1 or 2 months later. as you can see, we already have many more accessible locations and more details, more windows, more indoors, etc. At this particular point, we had 3 possible locations for the main objective, and I highlighted those in red. Those are the 3 main areas where the objective can be placed at that point. And this is also when I started freaking out about the scope of the map, because now I start to see a bit more that 200 by 200 in an urban setting is quite a lot, actually. Like, just have this little game yourselves, like pick the city where you're from or the city where you work, and just pick a 200 by 200. It's quite a lot. Of course, we like right now it's just a white box. I can work on that fast, but it has to be finished eventually. So it was a bit scary. But it was getting better and better all the time. We were having a lot of fun, and discovering new locations, opening new paths was really interesting. So now I just wanted to have a quick recap of the legacy of first-person shooter multiplayer maps, because there is quite a lot of legacy there as well. So traditionally, each player has the same set of abilities, and they all share a pool of weapons, and a selection of maps is available. And usually, traditionally, the maps offer different types of gameplay. Some maps sometimes are designed for specific game modes. Here I noted the hub-based design. So that is a very old school way of building maps, which is basically hub-based. So you have a set of hubs that are connected by corridors. Corridors can be streets, but the street is in a way a corridor. It could be like an underground tunnel. It could be like a walkway or whatever. So this is sort of like the hub-based design. Then the 3 lines rule. The 3 lines rule is basically that at any point given, when you want to go from A to B, usually the game will offer you 3 different ways to go there. Even if it's just 2 streets, one of them will have maybe like a little staircase to go up, or you can go in the street level. Usually this is like how it goes. And then there is the where am I, where do I come from, where do I go rule, which means that at any given point, you need to be able to answer those 3 questions very, very fast. And that's the key to have good map awareness, so you don't get lost. So I just put like a little illustration on those. So the hub-based thing, so I call it the classic. It's like if multiplayer maps were like architecture, I think they're similar to architecture, then they would have different styles as well. So the first one is the classic. So it's the hub corridor style that we mentioned previously. Everything is mostly 90 degrees, and it's very, very, very grid-based. Everything is meticulously calculated in terms of line of sight, timings to go from A to B. What if the terrorists spawn here and the counter-terrorists spawn there? They need to meet exactly there at this much time, etc. The neoclassic, so that's from Quake 3. It's the apparition of curves, but still very much on a classic grid. So it is a little bit, it's basically a grid-based system that's disguised very well. And it also has more verticality involved. It means that it's a little bit harder to predict and more action-packed. Well, that's from Quake 3, so you can get the idea. And then we have the modern style. That's from Call of Duty. This is where you can really tell it's the apparition of more organic, lifelike shapes. And it's also more based on real-looking locations. The layouts are much more complicated, and the grid is much less obvious. It has a more organic feel to it, and it results in a mix of both the previous styles. So what is a 9-to-5 multiplayer map then? Like, where is it in terms of those categories of multiplayer maps? Well, the first thing is that we are not really designing a space for reason X or Y. We are more providing a space that needs to accommodate all the elements that we have listed previously. We use an open world approach, but we're not an open world game. we just use the open world approach. We need shorter distances, obviously, since we play 3 rounds in about 15 minutes, which means that every round is about 5 minutes. We don't have vehicles of stuff like that, so of course we can't have a map that's really, really huge either. What we need rather than the size is the density and the unpredictability, because we need replayability as well. And that is what we have. I mean, what we had maybe 1-2 months ago, because I was on paternity leave. So basically, this is our map. That's the map that you saw previously, except that now it's more or less finished. So our map is very grounded in reality, because obviously we have used a real location layout that's been heavily altered, heavily modified, heavily play tested. So obviously it has nothing to do anymore with the real world location, but it's based on it. It's very dense. It has a lot of height variation, intricate network of location and connecting paths. Every location has multiple paths that lead to any other locations in the vicinity. We don't really have anything that's meticulously calculated like we saw in the traditional level design. It's rather meticulously adjusted. We just built something and then play tested it and then adjusted it based on the findings of our play sessions. So just like a couple points here. Unbalanced layouts are okay, really. I mean, the map hasn't been designed like a map from StarCraft or Counter-Strike, right? So obviously it isn't balanced per se. The first point is that we can learn a lot from skirmish tabletop war games. I'm going to take a couple examples, but in a few skirmish tabletop war games, like the players usually pick a scenario and then they set up the environment and then they get assigned an objective and then they get to deploy their troops. So basically they set up the environment without really knowing where they're going to deploy or without really knowing what's going to be the objective, which results in nobody having an advantage over the other, even though the layout might be completely unbalanced because they designed the layout without knowing what they're going to play. The terrain that you set up needs to work for any kind of scenario, with some exceptions, because if you have specific scenarios, then obviously it needs to be taken account into the terrain placement. Some objectives or troop placement can be random and they end up giving you a disadvantage, but that's okay. What you can be also learn from history is that the engagements are very rarely fair. You don't really want a fair fight. You want to win. You don't want to die. So every advantage you can get, you take it. Everything you can do to put your opponent at a disadvantage, you do as well. And a third point is that our environment is not really, it's designed by parameters that are completely outside of our control. For example, if you take like a look at history, generally speaking, and geography, some countries have resources that some other don't, and they developed based on their surroundings and resources available. I mean, for example, if you, or just like imagine you're playing Civilization. If you start in a location that has a lot of luxury resources or strategic resources, then if you don't have to worry about getting food, then you can focus on other things. So the place where you start is going to give you a certain advantage. But that doesn't mean that it's an advantage that you're going to keep forever. But our environment can be altered and we can adapt even if the odds are against us. Like you can see like in many, many different examples. Like this is sort of the feeling that we want to convey also in our level design and our map design. Just three very quick examples here. The Battle of Agincourt, October 14-15. So basically, the English troops created a choke point where the French army that was like ridiculously strong. They had like 10K heavy armored knights, so like top-notch troop for the time. They were hit by Englishmen that were much less numerous, much less quality. They just got completely obliterated because they were kind of choked between the trees, mud, etc. The field had been plowed, so cavalry was completely ineffective. The Battle of Teutoburg is the same kind of idea. 3 Romans legion, that's a lot of people. They were stretched over 20 kilometers on a narrow and muddy track. So it was quite easy for the alliance of Germanic tribes to ambush them and completely negate the inferiority in terms of numbers that they had. They would be locally much more numerous than the Romans. Or the Great Siege of Malta, where basically they had about 8,500 men with only 2.5K professional soldiers that defended the capital Valletta against the Ottoman Empire that had about 45,000 men, including 6,000 elite infantry. They managed to hold the city. And just another example from a board game. So let's Star and Slay here. Basically, here you play the Battle for Berlin at the end of World War II. The game itself and the scenario itself is completely unbalanced. For example, if you play a Russian, you get support units. You get basically virtually unlimited amount of troops. The German player, of course, has control of like much less quality troops, and he has to hold the city. So there is virtually no way that you can win as the German player. The only way for you to win is to hold Berlin longer than what they actually happen in history. So as you can see, like the game itself is completely unbalanced, but it can still be fun because it doesn't necessarily mean that everything needs to be balanced and perfectly balanced. Sorry. Another key point that we have in our game modes is that you play in a team of 3, and we have 3 teams of 3 for a total of 9 players, which means that the importance of your team is crucial in order to win. You are 3 players and you're potentially facing 2 other teams. 1 man down is 33% of your team just gone, which means that you need to be really, really careful. The environment is on nobody's side. Like this, again, going back to the unbalanced layout. The environment is on nobody's side. It can be on your side briefly if you are at a disadvantage. Maybe you can lure your opponent, as we saw in the previous examples, to a place where they will be at a disadvantage. You can choose the large map and the large layout allows you to choose your route and choose your approach. So you can sort of tailor your approach as you like and as you want. And also we have all sorts of gadgets and additional weapons, stuff like that you can choose and equip. So if you choose that smartly, then it gives you also other advantages. Oh, here I'm using as an example the hunting patterns of wolves, which basically hunt in a group, and they can't really kill a buffalo on their own. So what they do is they group up and they pick the weakest one, they surround it, they attack one of them, and then the rest goes away and they have won, and it's good. Let's talk briefly about the iterative loop as well. So the iterative loop is what we've been doing since the start. It's basically you build something, you play something, then you debrief something, and then you modify it. We started playing 9 to 5 super early. We're using Unreal Engine, which means that we had a lot of stuff built in, and it was not a huge, ridiculous amount of work to get started. So we managed to get our first playtests very early. We organized playtests with friends and family. We play a lot in the office. We also used partners in Canada and UK. Even though the game was in a very rough white box stage, like you remember the pictures that I showed previously where the map was just white and nothing was really finished. Well, we sent it to those guys in that state so that they could already play and see the potential. Because if people have fun with your map when it's at this stage, then it means that you have the core gameplay kind of good. You know, it doesn't need to be polished so that it's fun. Then the playtests are super important because they are the best way to get relevant feedback on the map. Maybe I think that this position here is completely unbalanced. Maybe I think that this or that or whatever, but it might be completely irrelevant because the playtest will prove me wrong. Quick iteration rounds also allow us to spend the time where we should. That's what I mean by that. It's basically we test something, this doesn't work, 80% of the players agree, then obviously we have to fix that. What I think needs to be fixed or needs to be improved might not be relevant. Maybe it's just me. Also, playtest with 8 other players gives you new perspectives. You want informations from different various cultures, play styles, backgrounds, skill levels, and expectations, because high-skill players have very different expectations than low-skill players, people that like to chill, people that like to snipe, people that like to run and gun, like all those players have different expectations. So you need to see what they think, so you get feedback that's relevant from those audiences. Here you can see a couple of pictures from our very first playtests. So we had a TV, so that was from the first playtest that we organized outside of Europe with the super early build. So we were just following those guys. The screen was split in 9, so we could follow Team Red, Team Green, and Team Blue, and watch them play at the same time. That was quite good and exciting to see other people, complete foreigners, playing the game for the first time. We have internal playtests several times a week. We have external playtests with partners and larger groups of people when we have the need for it. Like, it doesn't make sense to have it all the time, but when we introduce a new feature, a new game mode, stuff like that, we want to know what people think. We have also a really good community on Discord, and when we need their feedback or when we would like to hear their opinion, then we organized closed playtests with them, and that gives us very, very good, very valuable information. And we have also an analytics department, which is basically one guy right now. But it's very, very, very important because, as I mentioned previously, what I think is bad or what I think is good might not be true. The analytics provides super, super valuable data about player behavior. What you expect a player to do and what they actually do might be completely different things. Here, with the data, we can visualize what the people do, where they go, what guns they use, how long do they shoot for, how long did they get shot before they die, how fast they die, how fast they move, where do they die, like all sorts of things. You can identify the problems very fast. You can measure distances of engagements, everything. So this kind of helps driving your micro layout changes, maybe even justifies some bigger changes. Of course, the bigger changes are very, very expensive, but if there is an obvious problem in the playtest, then you should address those. And that's what we do. So that leads us to the fine tweaking and micro balancing. The macro layout doesn't really change that much. The macro layout is basically what I've shown you in the first couple of pictures. It's like this area, this area, this area. Those don't really change because it's what we call heavy surgery. It's very, very time consuming to change those, very risky, and it takes a lot of time. So that's why we test extensively first. So we put out the big masses and then we test. And then we start to detail layer by layer by layer. So then obviously, once we get to the detailing, it means that we have tested extensively and that it works. So we don't end up with bad surprises. Well, in theory. The micro layout, on the other hand, is easy to tweak. By micro layout, what I mean is that the position of a window, the position of a door, maybe a fire exit, a way to relocate from one floor to the other floor, go up and down fast, etc., etc. Most balance issue and the issue that we identify during the playtests and with the analytics, most of those issues can be solved by micro layout changes. Usually it's just a matter of fine tweaking, like props, covers, windows, all that stuff. It's quite easy to move, to change, to make it higher, lower, etc., etc. And of course, when you do that, you have to kind of think ahead and think about your future self. Like if you feel like something is going to bite you later, then you should tackle it right away. I mean, most of the time when you see something, you have a gut feeling that it's not going to work, or some playtest has proven that you were wrong and that this doesn't work or something. And you always get the idea that maybe if I change only this cover, maybe if I add a little window, that's going to be enough. But deep inside, you know that you have to do the big changes, and you sort of keep pushing those back, and you should not, because you're going to have to do it anyway. So think about your future self, like your future self of like in a week, in 3 weeks, in 6 months, like try to think about that guy in the future. And, when you're in 6 months later and that thing that you decided to do, now you don't have to do it anymore. Then you think about the past version of yourself and you're like, thank you. So here I've just put like a couple screenshots of the evolution of the layout, sort of to reiterate the point that the macro layout doesn't really change so much. It's more of the micro layout. So you can see some of the areas, those are taken maybe like a year apart. And of course, those screenshots I took like a few months back. But as you can see, the locations are fairly similar. Of course, things have changed. For example, the screenshot with the bridge, you can see that it's fairly similar. Like the fences on the left have been moved a little bit, but they're still here. The bridge is still here, it's just higher. The cars are still here. They have changed places, etc. The buildings are fairly similar. Of course, stuff have changed, but overall, not that much. And that is because we tested extensively so that we don't have to redo all those macro changes. And probably the most important thing is that you have to embrace the fact that you have no idea what you're doing until you actually until you're actually done with it and you're finished with it. Like most of my career, I mean professional career, I've done narrative games like TPS. I have never worked on a first-person shooter before professionally. As I mentioned earlier, I used to do a lot of modding, a lot of multiplayer maps for various games. But I have never actually shipped a first-person shooter before. So when we decided to do a first-person shooter, I was basically like, I had no experience about that. I mean, of course, I play a lot of games. I know how those games work. I just have never made one. And sometimes it's quite important because there is a lot of time where you're going to do stuff that you've never done before. And it's very exciting, it's very scary, but it's good for you. We're trying also something that's very, very new. I don't think I've seen anything like it before. Like we have 3 teams of 3 fighting each other's in a large maps for objectives that change, that have a narrative structures with 3 rounds where the end of a round affects the beginning of the next round and what happens in the next round. It has a bit of a narrative feeling to it. It's also mixing elements of tabletop, skirmish war games, and video games. There is no way that when you do something like that, there is only one thing you can do, is you can speculate based on your experience and what you've done before. But there is no way you can be sure about what you're doing. If you're working on the same game and doing sequels for 10 years, yes, you're going to be very good at making that type of game. You can ship another one of those games like in a year because you already know the recipe. I've always worked in different companies on completely new IPs, which means that every time I start a new project, I have no idea what I'm doing. And you can only speculate because there is no recipe. So you just have to suck it and act. There is nothing else you can do. And of course, you cannot learn if you don't fail, because if you succeed, then I guess maybe it was luck, maybe it was the talent of your co-workers, maybe it was the advices that you got. It can be a lot of things, but you cannot know for sure it was because of you. But if you fuck up, then obviously it's because of you, and you will not do it ever again. I mean, you will do it all the time, but you will do it a little bit less, or you will figure out your mistakes faster, which means that you lose less time. So you get better over time. And actually, I think I'm done. I was maybe a little bit too fast. I don't know. Maybe you guys have some questions. In any case, you guys should check out our website, check out the trailers on YouTube, check out our YouTube page. See if you're interested. You can subscribe. Maybe you can follow us. I think we have a Steam page nowadays. So check it out. Maybe it's the game for you. Maybe not. And that's pretty much it for me.